All right, this next set of notes picks up right where we left off and getting into the actual Civil War. But first we have to talk about the presidential election of 1860. So the election came down to 4 different candidates. We have Lincoln, Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge. However, in the North, it was only a race between Lincoln and Douglas, whereas in the South, it was really only a race between Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge. So no chance of Lincoln winning in the South. We see that it was only Douglas who actively campaigned. The other candidates had supporters campaigning for them, but it was only Douglas who publicly spoke and publicly made statements about his campaign. Douglas even went as far to warn Southerners of the consequences of secession, so Douglas was a bit bold in that sentiment. Talking about the actual results of the election, Lincoln wins, and we'll see over here by the graph, Lincoln is represented by the red, and so he wins all of the North and California and Oregon as well. Coming over and looking at these numbers, Lincoln only wins 40% of the popular vote. However, he wins 59% of the electoral vote. So looking into why and how did that happen, if we look at our electoral votes in the North, we see states like Ohio with 23 electoral votes, Pennsylvania with 27, New York with 35. These numbers are going to be substantially higher than our Southern electoral votes. So we come down south and we see Alabama with 9, Georgia with 10, South Carolina with 8. So because the North had a substantially higher amount of electoral votes, with Lincoln securing those votes, he's able to be successful in the election. Looking into why did the North vote for Lincoln? So Lincoln represented the northern region, him being from Illinois himself, and so a vote for Lincoln was a vote against the slave power. Lincoln also won some votes as far as nativism issues and concerns with nativism. So the Northern Democratic Party remained home of Irish and German Catholics, and so anybody who was anti-Catholic had no choice but to vote Republican and but to vote for Lincoln. We'll also see that Northerners just generally approved of Republican economic proposals, and so with these sentiments, Lincoln is able to secure the Northern electoral votes, and he's able to win the election. Looking into why did Lincoln's election lead to secession? So the Southerners were, of course, outraged over a Northern anti-slavery party victory, and this was because the Southerners feared that slavery would be voted out of existence with Lincoln's election. The Southerners also believed that they were victims in an unequal struggle of Northern aggressions on Southern rights, so saying that the Northern majority was imposing and oppressing the Southern minority as far as their rights. Some examples they would use to justify this would be the Southerners believing they were denied their share of Western territories, so again, just talking about which territories in the West would be free or slave. The South also feared, or they also felt they were unfairly taxed through high tariffs that were benefiting the North rather than the South. So they were paying taxes, but it all went to Northern industry rather than staying at home in the South. Looking into which state was the first to secede in the South, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. They're going to blame the North for attacking slavery, and South Carolina is even going to send commissioners to other Southern states in order to establish a meeting in 1861 to create a new government for the Southern states who were seceding from the Union. And we'll see that after South Carolina secedes, more Southern states are going to secede to form a new Confederate government. So here we have the Union, the secessionists, they're breaking away from the Northern United States. Looking into the Northern reaction to Southern secession, so the Republicans saw events in the South as a continuation of slave power conspiracy, and that because slavery was potentially threatened, the South was going to disassociate with the North. Northerners are also going to claim that it was only a small number of planters who had conned electorates into voting for secession. They believed that because slaveholders dominated politics in the Low South, it was going to be the slaveholders who were connected to congressmen who would then be able to persuade Congress to secede from the Union, and that there was no state that held an actual referendum on secession. It all came down to the people in power and to the people in charge of government, who would have been the plantation masters, to make the decision of whether or not they were going to secede from the Union. There was no statewide vote. It all came down to the people in power to decide that. And we also see that secession sentiment and this talk of disassociating from the Union was going to be strongest in states with higher slave percentages. So when it came to the Upper South, who had lower plantations and lower slaves in numbers and in populations, they tended to vote against disunion just because they didn't have as strong of a connection with slavery compared to the lower South. And so we'll see in this map here, the darkest color is going to be areas that were against secession. And so we see that it's mainly concentrated in the upper South. When we get into the lower South, we see a majority is going to be for secession because they were way more deeply connected with slavery and with the plantation agriculture. Looking into why was the upper South less secessionist? Again, the upper South had a smaller stake in slavery compared to the lower South. We also see that the upper South had closer ties with the North, and so they had more reason to fear economic consequences from secession. With these two in mind, this doesn't mean that the upper South trusted Lincoln. We see that Virginia and Tennessee legislature, they were ready to back up the seceding states, and they would oppose forcing any secessionists to join the Union. So they were more loyal to the South than to America. And that, yes, they're not as connected with slavery, but they're going to stand with their Southern brethren in their choice to secede. And so we'll see here, we've got Northern states, of course, Southern secessionists, and then we have these border states, the states in the upper South, who are going to be on the fence when it comes to secession. They don't make an immediate choice of seceding as we see in the lower South. So we'll have to see where they choose as time continues. Looking into, was a compromise even possible? So most Northerners initially believed that seceding states were bluffing. They thought that the South would come to their senses and they would rejoin the Union. Looking at it from a Southern perspective, most Southerners thought that the North would not fight to preserve the Union. They thought that the North would just let them go and that they were already seeing differences between free and slave statuses in territories in their own industries. And so with that breaking off, each side should be allowed to continue as best as they saw fit in promoting their industries, whether it be slave or free. And then we have those border states, mainly the upper South, who were confident in a compromise and that we can remain a union, we just have to talk things out, come to a middle ground. And so what's going to happen is that we have the lower South develop a Confederate Constitution, and it's modeled very closely on the US Constitution. The difference is it's going to protect slavery and guarantee state rights. And we'll have Jefferson Davis be appointed as provincial president and Alexander Stephens appointed as the vice president of the Confederacy. Again, looking further into, was a compromise even possible? So we have Buchanan, who was president right before Lincoln. He's president until March 1861, and his main concern was to not provoke a war between the Union and the South, so between the North and the South. He attempted negotiations, however, no actual actions were acted upon. And we also have the Senate who's going to recommend a Crittenden Compromise, which would say the Missouri Compromise line would be extended to the Pacific, so it would extend across the nation, and that slavery would be recognized south of this line, so in this area, in all territories. We'll also see that within this Crittenden Compromise, a constitutional amendment would even be made to guarantee no interference with slavery in current slaveholding states, and Congress would be forbidden to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. However, Republicans are going to reject this proposal because, again, it is promoting the expansion of slavery. Looking into what action did Lincoln take? So when it came to the North was all about avoiding this provocation. They didn't want to promote the South. They really hoped that the lower South would return to the Union. And Lincoln, he's going to maintain a strict silence, but he would be willing to compromise when it came to keeping the fugitive slave law in action. He would be willing to negotiate slavery in Washington, and he would even be able to, or willing to negotiate the New Mexico Territory as far as potentially expanding slavery into that area. However, for the most part, he's going to be firm on keeping slavery out of Western territories, and he is definitely determined not to concede too much to the South. Lincoln did, however, like most, have an exaggerated strength of the Union in saying that secession was a plot only by a small group of planters. So looking into Fort Sumter and its significance, so the Confederacy is going to take over most Southern forts with the exception of two, one being Fort Pickens and two being Fort Sumter. And so in January 1861, President Buchanan is going to send supply ships to Sumter because it's still being developed at the time. However, as the ship is approaching, South Carolina is going to open fire and their captain is going to retreat. And so we'll see Fort Sumter is located right here. It's right off of South Carolina. We have Charleston here. And so South Carolina being the first to secede, it's going to open fire as a Union ship is approaching a garrison, the garrison at Fort Sumter. And so secessionists from other states, they do warn South Carolina to cool down, just in saying that we're not ready to go to war with the Union yet. It is not yet time. And so they warn South Carolina to back off, and for a while things do cool down. So as a result of this, a truce of some sorts was agreed, and that South Carolina would make no further efforts to seize the fort, and Buchanan would send in no further aid to the area. In March 1861, just a couple months later, Sumter had become a symbol of national sovereignty for both sides, in saying that if the Confederacy was a sovereign nation, if it was its own nation and its own government, a foreign fort could not exist within its harbors, and that you can't have the Confederacy. You can't have the Confederacy and then one plot of a Union garrison right in the middle of it. That just wouldn't work out. We'll also see that Lincoln is going to declare to hold on to whatever remained of Southern federal property, and that at this point, the Confederacy had taken over multiple forts, multiple post offices, but Lincoln decided to stop the expansion of this and saying that anything else he would hold on to as Union property. So the actual beginning of Civil War. April 11th, just a few months later, we have a general who's going to demand Sumter's surrender. However, General Anderson is going to refuse this, and we have negotiations that will drag on for a few hours, but ultimately at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Confederate guns are going to open fire. And so over the next 33 hours, we have 5,000 rounds of artillery fired, but extraordinarily, there were no deaths in this battle. A couple days later, on April 13th, with fires raging throughout the fort, Anderson finally surrenders, and his troops were allowed to march out and evacuated into Washington. And so we see a nice picture of the battle with cannons, with fires, so Anderson had nowhere to go. All right, so continuing on, looking into the beginning of Civil War, a couple days later, on April 15th, Lincoln issues a call to arms for 75,000 men to help put down the rebellion for 90 days as a result of the attack on Fort Sumter. And so the Upper South at this time now had a choice in committing to one side or the other, and Virginia's decision in particular was going to be crucial just for their industrial capacity. Ultimately, it came down to a state convention that voted 88 to 55 to support their Southern brethren, and so Virginia secedes after the attack on Fort Sumter, and Richmond becomes the Confederate capital. And so we'll see here in this map, we have the Union, of course, we have the darker blue being the states that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter, we have the gray states who secede after the fall of Fort Sumter, and then we have the blue states who do not secede from the Union. And that's where we'll stop.